Okay, well, welcome everybody to the webinar. Thanks so much for your time today. Just want to get started for the morning or the afternoon. I'm Jane McLennan. I'm a dairy farmer in Greytown, and I've been working with Farm Focus for up to 6 months now, but I've been a user of the Farm Focus app and its predecessor for many years. The aim of this afternoon's webinar is to understand how to make the end of year transfer to your accountant seamless. So why is the end of year processing so important? Well, we want to ensure everything is completed correctly to help the financial year end process run smoothly and to start your new year in the correct position. The more you can do, the cheaper your accountant's fee is going to be. Every time they contact you, it costs you money. The more knowledge you have of your own business means the better control, which enables better conversations with your accountant and other trusted advisors. Good data means more accurate reports. Your monthly coding feeds into your reports, so it's important to get this information right and be consistent with your coding. Remember to plan as you code and code as you plan. And the beauty about Farm Focus is all the data is already there for all our great reports. So now what I'd like to do is move into the demonstration data. The first thing we need to kick off with is a little bit of housekeeping. We need to check that your accountant is invited into your Farm Focus file. To do that, go into Settings, Users, and add a user. Under the user access here, make sure you give your accountant organisation admin access. Now let's crack into the main body of the webinar. As I prepare for the end of the financial year, I ask myself 5 questions. The first question is, are my income and expenses in the correct financial year? With all farming businesses, we generally pay for a service the month following the actual event. For example, your June farmlands purchases are not paid until the 20th of July. These events cross between financial years and should be an expense in the year that they happened and not the year that they are paid. Before I make a start, we know the majority of sheep and beef farmers have the end of financial year on the 30th of June. But for the purposes of today's demonstration, we are going to use the end of the financial year as the 31st of March. This allows us to demonstrate the end of year process. So to ensure items are in the correct financial year, the invoice date needs to be allocated to the correct financial year. So it's all about the invoice date. It's the invoice date that dictates what financial year the service belongs. So if you use invoice scanner, connectors, or you upload your CSV files, Farm Focus will automate this process for you. It will pick up the invoice date and auto-populate it into the correct financial year. Now, if you don't use these tools, clearly we highly recommend you do, you'll need to check the invoice date is in the correct financial year. So here we've got our accountant's invoice here. If I click into that, you'll see the due date is the 20th of April and the invoice date is the 1st of April. Now, I know this service belongs to last financial year. Remember, for the purposes of this demo, I'm using end of financial year, the 31st of March. So I go into this calendar here, or I could actually just type over here, but I find it easier to go into the calendar, click in that, and make the invoice date in the previous financial year. I then save it. So now that accountant's invoice we picked up in the previous financial year. Next, I need to go to the completed screen, into the transactions. And I want to go and look through your bank transactions in the month post the end of your financial year. So in this instance, it's April. And check that the event is in the year it happened and not the year it was paid. For example, here, my farm supply invoice. You can see here the invoice date is the 1st of April and the payment date is the 20th of April. Now, this farm supply store is actually like the farmlands invoice, whereas I know all these transactions occurred in March, so that was last financial year. So I need to change this date until March. So I come along here to my 3 magical dots. Now, right through Farm Focus, we have these 3 magical dots all the time. Please don't be afraid of them. Click into them. There is more information behind. So I click into it. In this instance, there's only one option, View Transaction. I'm going to go into View that transaction. Now I'm going to move down here and I'm going to click on the Matched Invoice. And this will take me into the invoice date. Now I want to move this invoice date into last financial year. So once again, I do that by just clicking on the calendar and moving it back to the previous financial year and then saving it. Now that you'll see that this farm store invoice, well, it's not yet, but it's going to take a while. Oh yes, it's now moved over to last financial year. Now, if you don't use the invoice function and you code the bank transactions directly, then you will need to establish an invoice date in the correct financial year. For example, here, tractor repair invoice here, you'll see the invoice date and the payment date are the same day. Yet I know I did this tractor service last financial year, and I need to change the invoice date because that dictates what financial year it belongs to last financial year. So once again, I go into my 3 magical dots, I click on them, and this time I get the option to add an invoice date. I add an invoice date, and I'm going to make it last financial year, and then I apply. And you'll now see my tractor repair service has now moved, the invoice date has moved to the correct financial year. Now you have to apply the same logic to your livestock sales and purchases. Now all your invoices for livestock sales and purchases have an invoice date, have an event date. And this event date determines which financial year that livestock sales or purchases should belong. So please go and check your sales and purchases for your livestock and check that the correct event date is in the correct financial year. So the second question I like to ask myself is my needs action screen up to date? So to do that, I flick back into my needs action screen. Remembering my invoices are on the left-hand side and my bank transactions on the right. And in here, I want to check that I have no invoices or bank transactions from last financial year still sitting here. Now look at here, I've got this one to the council back from August 2022. This is a really old invoice. I'm going to deal with that later, but in the interim, I'm going to go and look at this hardware store invoice. Clearly, this is dated March, so it's in last financial year. I want to click on here. You'll see it's already coded. The invoice date is in the correct financial year. I scroll down here and I want to match this invoice. Now you'll notice that Farm Focus automatically identifies the most likely transaction to match it to, and it brings it to the top. I press click there, and you'll note that there is nothing more to pay. The invoice matches the bank transaction, and I save it. And now that is moved from my needs action screen to my completed screen. I'll do the same for my accountant. Again, it's been coded. I'm going to match it Again, the most likely invoice has been pulled to the top. I click on it, it's been fully paid, and I save. And then I move to my bank transaction side. And I note here that there is a bank charge transaction still here waiting to move to my completed screen. So I click on that. Again, it's already been coded because I've got a bank transaction coding rule. I can simply save that, and it too has moved into the completed page. Now I want to come back and look at this really old invoice here. It's really important at the end of the financial year to have what I'm calling rogue invoices sitting in your needs action screen. These are invoices that have been paid but are still sitting in your needs action screen. And sometimes, like this council one, they can be months old. They have not been matched with the payment made or money received. So basically the invoice is sitting in no man's land. Now, it's really important that we deal with these invoices as they will be double counted by your accountant when processing your end of year accounts. They've been paid, so they've been counted once, but because the invoice continues to sit in your needs action screen, it will flow through to your closing accounts receivable and payable report, so it's counted twice. So any invoice, whether that rogue or otherwise, left in your needs action screen requires further investigation. So the first thing I want to check is whether this invoice has been paid. To do that, I move into my completed screen and I search for the invoice. Now we've got a great search function here within Farm Focus, and I know the invoice is for the council, so I'm going to start to type council, and there we have it. Here are my 3 transactions for the financial year for the council sitting in my completed page. Now I want to move into transactions, and I can see that in February and November I have an attachment for each of my transactions here, but for August I don't. So this invoice here has already been paid, the corresponding transaction has been coded, and it's sitting in my completed screen. So what does this mean? It basically means the invoice has been paid, but I coded the bank transaction rather than matching it to the invoice. So what do I do now? Well, I can tell that this invoice has been locked into a final GST return by this icon here, which means it's been filed with IRD. So how I approach this differs from whether I am payment basis for GST or invoice basis for GST. Now, this afternoon, I'm only going to cover what to do if you're payment basis for GST, as the majority of our clients are payment basis. If you are invoice basis for GST and you have some of these rogue invoices sitting in your needs action screen, please call our trusted team on 0800 888 080, and that's number if you're New Zealand based, of course, and talk to our trusted team, as there's a few more steps that you need to go through. But it is important that they are dealt with before you send your end of year accounts to your accountant, as we don't want anything double counted. So payment basis people, what are my options? Well, the invoice must be deleted from the needs action screen. But I first want to make sure I retain the PDF, and I need to move the PDF into my transactions in my completed screen because I want this really great information from my invoice. So to do that, I click into the invoice. I go up to this paperclip up here and I click into that. I open the attachment. Always takes time when you're watching. And then I download the invoice. Now the invoice will download into my downloads file, so I save it there. And then what I want to do is move to my completed screen and attach it. So I go down to my August transaction, click into here, once again go into my paperclip. Now I can drag and drop. I've got 2 screens or duplicate screens, but in this instance I'm going to use the browse function I'm going to find that invoice, which is just here, and I'm going to attach it. So now the invoice has been attached. I'm going to click out of here. You'll see now there's an invoice there. But what I need to always remember is I need to go back now and delete it from my needs action screen, because I have saved this invoice now within my bank transactions. So I'm going to delete that. Job done. So to summarize, you don't want any invoices or bank transactions from the prior financial year sitting in your needs action screen. If you have invoices from previous financial years left in your needs action screen, you need to deal with them. This is especially important if they are older invoices that may have been paid and are still sitting or hanging out in the needs action screen. If you've got bank transactions from previous financial years sitting in your needs action screen, you need to code or match these transactions so they move into the completed screen. And remember to check the invoice date is in the correct financial year. So the third question I need to ask myself is my bank account balanced? And to do that, I go into my balancing screen. So here you'll see a green line here, which tells me where I'm balanced up to. And I'm balanced up to the 31st of March, which is great because that's the end of my financial year. And you need to be balanced up until the end of your financial year. Now, you should always be balanced if you're using bank feeds. Now, using bank feeds is a game changer and probably one of the best things you can do to maximize your farm focus functionality. It ensures accuracy of data and it will save you so much time. So if you're not using bank feeds, I really encourage you to do so. And it's a really simple process to establish these bank feeds. You go into settings, you go into bank accounts, you go into your bank account and you scroll down, and every bank is different, but there is a basic form you need to complete or some steps you need to take to establish now your bank feeds. Now, if you're not feeling confident to do this, please call our help centre and they will walk you through it. Now, I know a lot of our Australian friends do not have bank feeds. We are aware of that, but for those that do, please use them. Now, going back to our balancing page. Now, if you don't balance, it's most likely because you've got some uncoded transactions. See here it says coded. If you're not balanced, often it's because you have an uncoded transaction. So please code that transaction. If you're still unbalanced, it's likely to be for two reasons. First of all, you may have accidentally deleted a bank transaction. And if you have, you'll see it here in the deleted page. Just click into here. If there's a deleted bank transaction, it would be sitting here. There'd be my three magical dots at the end, and I'll just reinstate that bank transaction. The other reason that you may not balance is that you may have, in the needs action screen, created a manual bank transaction by using this plus record button. If you have done that, it's actually really easy to spot because it will say manual entry. And if you've got bank feeds, it will say bank feeds every time here, and there'll be one manual entry, and that will be the most likely reason you're unbalanced. Now, if you're still having trouble balancing, there's this little icon here that takes us through to our Help Centre resource. If you're still having trouble, please ring our Help Centre because they are here to help you. Now, if you have a manual bank account, you will need to manually enter the bank balance at the end of each month from your bank statement, and you just simply add your bank balance in here from your bank statement. So the fourth question I ask myself is, do I need to correct any coding? And to do that, I go back into my completed page. Now, there are two types of coding errors. There is inconsistent coding and incorrect GST treatment. So first of all, I'm going to look at my inconsistent coding. Basically, have I coded my items correctly? Now, providing I don't change the GST treatment from business to personal or personal to business, I can change my codes whenever I like, even if I filed them in a transaction that has been submitted to the IRD. So what I like to do is I use these drop-down arrow keys, and I click on the drop-down arrow key here for the code. And it sorts now by my code type. Now these drop-down arrow keys are actually really beneficial, and you'll see them right through Farm Focus. For example, I could sort by other party, or I could sort by payment date. But in this instance, I want to sort by code. And then what I suggest you do is you run your eye down all your codes looking for any inconsistency. Now you can change code directly when you're on this coded line screen. For example, here, my country weed sprayers invoice. Now, I know that in October, this spraying out should have actually been associated with my pasture renewal that occurred in October. So I want to change this code. So I simply, if I click on here, it tells me how it's already coded, weeds and pest contract spraying. I want to change that to pasture renewal. So I'm going to go for P, and all of a sudden, there it is there, pasture renewal spraying. I change the code, and boom, it's gone. Now, if I was to sort under other party, or actually I'll use the search key here, I'm going to put under weed. Okay, here it is here. So here's my invoice that I've just changed the code for. So it's very easy to change the code. You don't have to drill down into the invoice. It takes no time at all. Now, the second type of coding error that I look for is inconsistent GST treatments. Now, if you have any GST discrepancies, i.e. an item that has been locked into a GST return, which has been filed with IRD, and you want to change the GST type from business to personal or vice versa, you can still do this by way of a reversal transaction or journal entry. Now, I'm not going to cover that this afternoon. We do have a great Help Centre resource on that called How to Create a GST Reversal. So please read that. But we would also advise that you can consult your accountant before you actually change your GST treatment. So I guess really the key message here is that you can change your codes even if they have been filed with the IRD, as long as it's not impacting on the GST treatment. And having the correct codes ensures rich data and more meaningful, consistent information. So please go through and check your codes. Now, if it does impact, changing your codes does impact on your GST treatment, you can still make the changes. It is slightly more complicated, and we'd recommend you probably consult your accountant before you do it. So, question 5. The last question I ask myself, are my closing livestock tallies correct? To do that, I go into my working plan here, hop into my working plan, and go into my livestock grid. Now, my livestock grid here shows my livestock movements throughout the financial year. Now, we're in the livestock grid. We're talking about quantities of stock. If I was in my cash flow, this is all about the dollars, but we're looking at the livestock grid. On the left-hand side here, I have my opening numbers, and over here, I have my closing and totals and my opening for next year. We have our stock classes down here on the left-hand side, and the order of these stock classes has come through from your farm codes. So again, if you want to change the order or edit or deactivate some of your farm codes, go into settings, codes, farm codes. Now, we haven't got time to talk about that this afternoon. But for each livestock category, if you click on this drop-down arrow here, you have all the possible events: sales, purchases, transfer in and out, deaths, missing. And once again, these two pull through from your farm code list. So some tips here about the stock rec. What you need to do first of all is check that your opening balances here are correct. Now, ideally, last year's closing tallies should equal this year's openings. If they don't, and sometimes we just want to draw a line under the stand, you can make changes to your opening numbers. So here I just want to click on mixed age ewes. This takes me through to my opening numbers. I closed at the end of 21-22 with 3,000 ewes, and so therefore I'm going to open the next financial year with 3,000 ewes. I've decided that I made a mistake and I want to change that to say 3,500. I make the change there, I save it, and see the 3,000 there has changed to 3,500. I've got this little red triangle here at the end. This is just giving me an alert, letting me know that my opening numbers have been adjusted, but nothing else there. So please just check your opening numbers are correct and make any changes as required. Now remember, your closing tallies age up to become, your closing tallies here age up to become your opening tallies. By way of information, we've had quite a bit of feedback from our farmers on this, and in next week, this title here is actually going to change to year-end tallies. And here, this is going to be renamed to closing after aging, which equals next year's opening. So we're changing the naming structure of these, and you'll see that next week, hopefully. Now, the aging process. The aging process can trip up some people, but it is an industry standard. If you just remember that stock age up on the last day of the financial year. So lamb, 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 lamb. And then on the last day of the financial year, they age up to hoggets. Now, my last day of the financial year is the 31st of March. So my stock age up on the 31st of March. If your closing balance is the 30th of June, your stock age up on the 30th of June. So it's just an industry standard. Given that, there should be no lambs or calves in your opening numbers, as they have all aged up at the end of the financial year and are born during the year. A good rule of thumb when you code livestock events is just to ask yourself, what age were they at the beginning of the financial year, and code accordingly. Don't think about what age they are in the paddock, because that might be quite different to the age they are in the stock rec. I would also recommend you adopt the KISS principle in your livestock rec, which stands for keep it simple, silly, or stupid. Otherwise, it can get overly complicated to manage. For example, I wouldn't have a separate stock class for cold ewes. At the end of the day, they are mixed age ewes. And if you want to record that level of data, record it in the description or the notes. And a hot tip for our sheep and beef friends is that here we've got this eye icon. If you click on that, you get the opportunity to add stock units. And so see down the bottom here now, not only have I got my farm quantities, but I've also got my total stock units. And if I click on that, I can split them between my sheep and beef stock units. Now, from an accountant's perspective, having an accurate livestock reconciliation prepared in Farm Focus makes their lives so much easier. It is better for the farmer to document their numbers than for the accountant to have a go in their office. So we want to ensure our stock tallies in here are correct. How do we go about that? Well, I once again ask myself several questions. The first one is, I ask, have I entered my non-financial events? That's my births, deaths, and missings. Have I consistently put in a quantity for my sale and purchases? And for that matter, is the quantity correct? And have I used the correct extended code when coding my sales and purchases? Now, what I do is I ask myself those questions as I methodically work down each of the stock categories. And as soon as I've finished one, I snap it back up and I move into the next one. So it is very simple to add non-financial events. For example, I've just completed my drenching, and although my stock rec tells me I've got 800 two-tooths, when I did my drenching in April, I realized, or I counted, only 780, so 20 have died. So I click into my deaths column here under two-tooths, and then I add an event. So it's in April, the event is a death. I could add a description here, and I'm going to put the deaths noted at drenching, and I'm going to add 20, and then I'm going to save. So see how here we've now got 20 deaths, and the on hand has moved from 800 to 780. Now it's just as easy to add births. So I'm going to go into my sale lambs. Now in here, I have already added my births, but I actually want to add some births in September. So once again, I click into the cell and I press add. This time it's in September. The event is now birth. If you use this drop-down arrow key, these are the other events that you could use. Now for a birth, I do need to enter my parent code. So who was the mother of these births? So I'm going to put mixed age ewes, and then I'm going to put 100 extra births in September, and I'm going to save. And so now I've got 100 additional births. So it's very simple to complete. And what we often find, though, is at the end of the financial year, users will ring us up and say, I'm sure I've entered my births and deaths, but they're not coming through. And what actually generally is the case is that farmers have entered their births and deaths in their plan, but not actually in their actuals. So in this stock rec grid, your actuals here are sitting on top of your plan. And so people are adding their births and deaths to their plan, but you actually also need to add them as actuals. And please also, another trick of the trade really is that you can use your non-financial events as a tool to correct your stock numbers. So if you know, if your stock numbers are, like for example, what we did with the two-tooths is with 780, you know you've got 780, but your stock rec's saying you've got 800. Make 20 missing or kill 20, but use the non-financial events as a way of correcting your stock numbers. Now, your purchases and sales should already be recorded because you have physically received some money, but you need to always check that the quantities and weights for the sales and purchases have been added, because this gives really rich data. So for example, I'm going to go into my lamb sales again, and this time I'm going to click on sales. Now, when I click on here, note I only get the option to view and not to add. You only get the option to add in your actuals for non-financial events. So I'm going to click into here, and then this takes me to a summary of all my lamb sales throughout the financial year. And what I like to do here is just manually check that everything makes sense. And I just run my eye down these columns. Now, clearly this doesn't make sense. I've only sold one lamb and I've sold it for 115K. I know that isn't correct. So it's, again, simple to make changes. I just go into my 3 magical dots, click on them, and I view the actual page. And look here, my quantity is 1. I can simply change that back to what it really should be. And I've checked my invoice and it's actually 800. So I I revise that and I save. And now these numbers here make a lot more sense. Now, the other thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is that we've got our averages sitting here. So if you click on this drop down arrow, here you can see your averages. Now you can either look at your averages for your live weight or your carcass weight. And here We've got for our carcass weight, our kilograms per head, our price per kilogram, and our price per head. And this is really useful information, especially when you're doing your planning. Now, the other thing I probably should have alerted you to is you can also just simply change your code if you've used the wrong extended code. If you've actually originally documented that you have sold lambs, but actually they were ewe hoggets, you can just quickly make that change here. Likewise, you can change if it's not a per head, it's a total kg basis, or it's a live or carcass weight. So you can make the changes there very, very simply. So the livestock transactions are really important. It's important that our livestock grid is correct, because stock numbers, especially for sheep and beef farmers, impact on your financial performance and your tax. So please spend some time getting these numbers correct. Banks also use the stock rec when they compare your performance against other farmers. So ensure all your sales and purchases have been coded correctly, and your non-financial events during the year have been entered, such as your births and deaths. So what other information does my accountant need to complete? Does my accountant need to complete my draft set of accounts? Well, capital expenditure is one of those things. Your accountant will want a copy of invoices for all your capital expenditure over $500. Now, if you've used your invoice scanner, there should already be an invoice attached, so you don't need to do anything. If you haven't used the invoice scanner, you are able to add the invoice or attachments retrospectively. For example, I know that last year I purchased a Can-Am. So I've gone and used again my wonderful search function for my Can-Am. I've gone into here and I note that I don't have an attachment. Now, if I consider it important, and I do consider it important for capital expenditure, I can actually go back into my emails and find that invoice and attach it retrospectively. All I need to do is click on this paperclip here, press browse, and then if I've already downloaded it, I just simply attach it here. Also, I could use the drag and drop function to do that. Bank statements. All accountants are different, but as a minimum, they will want a copy of your bank statement that specifies your balance on the last day of the financial year. The other thing I would encourage you to do is use our asset register. At the end of the financial year, check that you've entered all new assets on the assets register. Now, the asset register can be found under Settings, Asset Register, and you just simply add an asset. Now, this asset register does not calculate depreciation, as that is what your accountant takes care of when they move your accounts to their general ledger. But it is worth registering all new assets purchased and sold during the financial year and building up your asset register. So what are some other tips and tricks that I'd like to show you? Well, in an ideal world, you would have invoices attached to the majority of your transactions. Gone are the days of boxes of invoices being dropped off at your accountants, as all the invoices are now saved directly onto Farm Focus. So I no longer have to store my 7 years of invoices in my garage because they're all online. So what I like to do is go into my completed page, and I'm just going to get rid of this search again like that. In the month, and again into transaction, into the last year financial year, and I like to check that I basically have an attachment on the majority of my transactions. Now, if I don't have a attachment, if there isn't attachment, I consider it important, I can attach it retrospectively. Now, if you haven't been using connectors, invoice scanner, or uploading CSV files, then this is probably a bridge too far to go back and attach all your invoices. But maybe it can be a goal for you for next year, because having these PDF attachments sitting here makes your life and your accountant's life a lot easier. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that you can attach as many PDFs and JPEGs as you like to a transaction. I attach additional information such as contracts, lease agreements, sale and purchase agreements, my resource consents, or any other legal documents. Basically, you can attach as many attachments as you like. I'm just going to do this just for the fun of it. It's not related at all to a transaction, and you can do it retrospectively. Now, just as a side, I actually attach, you know how I talked about requiring a bank statement with the end of the, that identifies your bank balance at the end of the financial year. What I like to do is I actually attach that to my last transaction for the financial year. So I go into it, and here I would attach the my last bank statement, and also any other information my accountant has requested, such as my dividend statements and any other information that the accountant asked for. So I don't have to drop in any paper copies at all to my accountant. And what I do here under particulars is I add plus end of financial year docs, and I save it. And so here I'm alerted to me saving additional information on my last day of my financial year. And I tell my accountant what I've done as well. And as a side, I actually also write a summary of the financial year just been, such as whether it's been, a really, wet season, I've employed a new staff member, I've upgraded my wool shed, just a few bullet points of the year gone. And I save it as a PDF and I attach it here. And I find that a really useful tool, because it means that, in 3 or 4 years' time, I can go here and I can open up that attachment, and it gives me it jogs my memory of what actually happened that financial year. And it could explain some unusual behavior in my transactions or in my financial accounts for that financial year. So another thing, and we've already touched on it, is that we've got this wonderful search function to find old attachments or transactions that you might be interested in doing. You can search here in the different financial years. You can create a custom date range if you would like. You've got the ability to sort by other party or any reference or particulars, but you can also use the search function here to find any particular transaction that you're wanting to look for. So that's about it for this afternoon. Let's go back to the aims of our webinar. So our aim for this webinar was to understand how to make the end of year transfer to your accountant seamless. Now, what I did to do that, I asked myself 5 questions. So the first question I asked myself were, are my income and expenses in the correct financial year? And can you remember how I updated the invoice date? And I'm sure that the invoice date is the date that dictates what financial year a service was undertaken. The next question I asked myself is my needs action page up to date? And in here, I went into my needs action screen and I checked that it was free of any invoices or bank transactions from the last financial year. The third thing we talked about was, is my bank account balanced at the end of the financial year? And remember, I went into my balancing tab and I checked that little green line there, which told me where I was balanced to, and I was balanced up until the end of the financial year. The next question I asked myself is, are my coding rules correct? Remember, we went into our completed page there and I sorted by coding rules. I ran my eye down all the coding rules to make sure they were correct. And I knew that I could change the coding rules right there in the coding in that screen. And finally, I asked myself, are my closing livestock numbers correct? And I did this by going into my livestock grid, checking my opening numbers, checking that I'd added quantities, and that I'd added my non-financial events like my births and deaths. So once you've completed all these steps and you know all your invoices for the last financial year are imported and coded into Farm Focus, you can drop your accountant an email and let them know your books are ready to be processed. Now, if you've followed these simple steps, it should be a quick process for your accountant to upload your accounts onto their general ledger so they can work their magic. But please remember, if you need further support, we have a help centre within Farm Focus that's full of amazing resources, along with a fantastic customer success team who are available for you at the end of the phone. We also have our own chat box that lives within the Farm Focus. And again, it's a really good technique if you just want to ask one quick question. Our team are all Kiwis. They all use Farm Focus in their own businesses and understand Farm Focus 100%. Well, I think that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. As I said, a recording of the webinar will be available on our website in the near future. So bye for now. Thank you for your time, and I hope your season next year is a good one. Thank you.